I have a theory that the quality that makes a person immune to manipulation, whether that's a manipulative person or cult leaders or psychological operations or manipulation by industries, that quality is love. And I don't mean love as it's often defined as some kind of positive feeling or a state of affection. I mean love as a rational quality that guides our thinking and our decision making. Some people may look back at situations where they were manipulated and think, oh, I was manipulated because I was so loving, I was so generous and open hearted, and that's why I was taken advantage of. And I used to think that too. And guess what? I was totally wrong. Manipulation is fear working on fear. That's my definition of it. Fear has no power over love, but it has a lot of power over fear. We can only be manipulated to the degree that fear, trauma, and insecurity operate within our minds and our hearts. This episode is for anyone interested in healing and reclaiming their power, perhaps their financial well being, their health, or their confidence, after being manipulated by someone or some system, some industry, cult, or government psychological operation. We've had a few of those in the last few years, haven't we? And this episode is for anyone who wants to be manipulation proof moving forward, being immune to manipulation. Why is that so important? So that you can use your resources, your time, your money, your energy for your vision and goals, rather than for someone else's agenda. I'm Lauren Geertsen, and welcome to the Truth Activist Podcast. This is where we dive into hidden history, secret agendas, and global awakening. And though we discuss some heavy topics, the focus always remains on empowerment and healing. Because with enough truth, we can heal everything. Let me start by telling you a story about scorpions. And scorpion is now the term I use for any high-level manipulator, career manipulator, we could say, like narcissists or psychopaths. And this story is from the first chapter in my book, The Scorpion and the Lion. That book is part whistleblower expose and part spiritual memoir. It shares the story of how I discovered and then whistleblew the sexual abuse cover-up at the nutrition school I attended, which was the Nutritional Therapy Association. Here's the story. It's 3 months into our relationship, and we have yet to eat out in public together. In the secrecy of Jay's home, he has prepared another one of his chef-worthy dinners for us. Thick fillets of salmon, skin seared to a crisp crust, and roasted fingerling potatoes, slathered in garlicky pesto. We take our plates to his kitchen table, light the candles, dim the lights. As I take my first mouthful, Jay asks, "Baby, have I ever told you my favorite parable?" "A parable? Like a parable from the Bible?" I ask, perplexed. Jay is the last person I'd expect to recount a Bible story to me. "No," he says, "a parable is any story with a deeper spiritual meaning. I heard this story in college. It's called The Scorpion and the Frog." He proceeds to tell me the story with the full force of his charisma, as if he is entertaining an entire dinner party and not just his college-aged girlfriend, or dinner date, or client, or whatever I am. The story goes like this. A scorpion needs to cross a river, so he asks a frog to carry him on his back. The frog hesitates, afraid of the scorpion's poison. The scorpion says, "Don't be silly. If I stung you on the way across the river, we would both die. I will keep you safe to preserve myself." "Trust me," says the scorpion. "We're in this together." Halfway across the river, the scorpion stings the frog, and the frog starts to drown. Before his head goes under, the frog asks, "Why did you sting me?" "I am a scorpion. It is my nature," the scorpion replies. I stare at Jay blankly after he tells me the story and say, "I don't get it." Jay looks at me with a gleam in his eye. "Don't you see?" he says. "We are who we are." God, I just love that line. It is my nature. At the beginning, Jay told me exactly who he was. I didn't yet know how to see such darkness. And if you want to know how the rest of the story unfolds, that is in my book, The Scorpion and the Lion. For those of you who've read the book, you know that it outlines what I call the predator's playbook. And this is the rhetoric and manipulation tactics that was employed by Jay. That was the name I gave him in the book. His real name was John Jennis, and he was a teacher at the Nutritional Therapy Association. He was also a pretty well-known body worker in the Seattle area. And before that, he worked as a body worker for the American Ballet Theater in New York. And during his whole career as a body worker and nutritionist, about a 30-year career, he was grooming and sexually abusing his young students and clients. And I was one of them. And by divine guidance that still blows my mind to this day, I woke up to the extensive mind control and black magic that he had used to very literally almost push me off the brink of sanity. When I woke up to the mind control and the level of abuse that I had experienced, I started digging for the truth. And I found a lot of skeletons in his closet, not only his, but also in the closet of the founder of the Nutritional Therapy Association. In fact, I came to the conclusion that there had been a cover-up from the top. Now, for the sake of this podcast, I'm going to say that there were alleged, keyword for this podcast, alleged reports of sexual abuse and harassment against Gray Graham, who was the founder of the Nutritional Therapy Association. And when I learned all this, I decided to whistleblow. And it was a high-stakes experience where I cut my teeth on bringing truth to corruption. I witnessed how people tend to respond to uncomfortable truth. And I got to see how masses of people who consider themselves good people were actually manipulated into defending a serial rapist and attacking his victims. It was a profoundly painful experience for me to live through that, just an absolutely heinous smear campaign, and I was just floored almost beyond my comprehension to watch so many of my colleagues who would have described themselves as good people, people who their closest identity to their heart would have been things like good Christian father or staunch feminist or, empathic, intuitive healer, and yet they just totally missed the boat and were playing for the wrong team when I exposed the corruption in our community. As painful as that experience was, it's been quite a few years now, and I have emotional distance, and I can look back and glean such wisdom from that experience because it was really useful to see these people defend predators and recognize the manipulation that was at play and why it was working on them, recognize the rhetoric that was being used and why they fell for it, and of course I was piecing together how that rhetoric had worked on me to be totally blind to the abuse and the grooming that I had experienced. A few years after this whistleblowing, COVID rolled around, and the exact same dynamics that I had seen in my community of like a couple thousand people, I saw happen on a global scale. The same rhetoric used by my abuser was suddenly coming out of the mouth of the quote experts. And sometimes the exact same phrases, like specifically, you're being selfish if you don't do X, Y, or Z. That was a line that just gave me deja vu. And I was like, oh, this is in the Predator's playbook. Like they all know this one because it works so well. We certainly saw it work well during COVID, didn't we? I started to realize that the most effective manipulation technique perhaps is convincing someone of a warped definition of love. Because I think there's something in people where we want to be loving and kind. And when we're not combining that desire with intelligence and discernment, we can really be led astray when we're presented by a false definition of love, especially by people we put in an authority position. So let's look at some examples of that. One example is it happens in families where our parents may give us a warped definition of love. So, for example, in my own family, my father is a narcissist. And one of the unspoken rules in my family growing up was um, don't give any kind of criticism to my dad. Don't tell him how his actions are hurting you. Don't give him anything that could sound like critique or criticism. And like, effect, don't poke the bear. And so I kind of had this thought of like, oh, well, that means people pleasing and keeping the peace is a form of love. Well, actually, it was just a form of trying to achieve psychological safety in a very unhealthy family dynamic. But I think that that is relatively common. We start to confuse peacekeeping and suppressing the truth and not speaking truth to power, so to speak, as a form of love when it's actually the opposite. COVID provides another example of how we can assume a false understanding of love. Remember the rhetoric around the experimental nanotechnology graphene oxide shot, which was if you don't get the shot, you're going to kill grandma. Even if you don't think you need the shot, just get it to keep your family and community safe. If you love your family members, get the shot. If you love your community, get the shot. Don't be selfish. Don't be selfish, right? And how many people fell for that? Because on the surface, that kind of sounds like the loving thing to do if we don't apply wisdom and discernment. Another big example of how we're sold a false concept of love is through religious programming. Now, I'm familiar with how this happens through Christian theology because that is the flavor of religious programming that I grew up with. And some of you know that my last book that I recently released is called Jesus Rewritten: How Christianity Changed His Life, Death, and Message. And I wrote this book because I grew up a devout Christian, and then at 21 years old, in meditation, I had a sudden mystical awakening that totally shattered my religious beliefs. And that sent me on a decade-long journey through Christianity's hidden history, lost gospels, and theological plot holes. I started asking some really deep questions that I hadn't asked before around theology and concepts that I had just unquestioningly accepted because they were repeated to me and told to me by authority figures. And one of the questions I started to ask was, what is love? And does the biblical God really embody love? Is that actually a character of love? Or is it possible that that depiction of God stems more from human ego than an accurate representation of divine love? So, for example, standard Christian theology goes like this. It says that God, quote, so loved the world that it needed a virgin human man sacrifice to forgive humanity of our sins. And without such a sacrifice, without this blood atonement, humans would then be unworthy of spiritual solace and we would suffer infinite torture in hell. That is at the core of standard Christian theology. Now, first of all, this is not at all what Jesus taught. And I go into that and I provide the receipts in the book Jesus Rewritten, including from some early gospels that arguably are earlier than the gospels in our Bible that show Jesus completely rejected and repudiated this blood sacrifice superstition that's the core of this theology. Because it's not love to require an innocent person to die for guilty people. That's also not justice. No matter what way you look at it, there's no justice there. Requiring an innocent person to die for just like guilty people, that doesn't fix anything. It's not love to require a blood sacrifice. That's really twisted, actually. Now, I know some people might feel really confronted when they're hearing this, and I get it. These ideas would have really confronted me when I was like really steeped in religious programming. So maybe you just need to take some time, chew this over, and also recognize that I'm not criticizing people who believe these things. I'm critiquing the ideas. I'm not attacking the people who accept the ideas. But yeah, getting back to this theology, it's not love to require a blood sacrifice. It's also not love to send people to infinite punishment for finite sins. And it's not even possible for a loving God to forgive people in the first place. That's also the crux of the matter, because God, if it is the ultimate source of love, cannot hold a state of unforgiveness in the first place. Unforgiveness is a love impoverished state of consciousness. So that is a human experience when we don't have the big picture, when we don't have spiritual wisdom enough to understand why people are acting the way they do, and when we are in a state to be hurt by other people because we have not fully embodied love. Because if we have fully embodied love, we cannot be hurt by other people's fear or trauma or pain. And I'm going to get into that in a little bit. But if God is love, then God cannot be hurt by human actions, and God cannot even need to forgive us because it can't hold a state of unforgiveness. I took some time unraveling and unpacking that theology because it's so core, especially in Western civilization, and whether or not we consciously recognize it, it kind of can feed into a concept of people being worthy or unworthy of divine love. And just it creates a very warped and distorted definition of love that theology does. So I wanted to take some time to unravel that as a big example of how we can be sold a warped definition of love, and then our behavior can be manipulated. And we certainly see that when we look at the history of religion. If we have a distorted concept of love, then we become very susceptible to manipulation. If we think that love is self-sacrifice, or staying quiet to keep the peace, or validating our fears or someone else's fears, then we are very easily manipulated by narcissists or cults or agendas. So that's why I've spent some time giving examples of how we might develop a warped definition of love. And now what I want to go into is some specific characteristics of what love really is, a more accurate understanding of love. These are some principles that you can apply when asking the question, when it comes to any kind of decision in your life, what is the loving action here? What is the loving thing to do? So the first principle is that love is a state of consciousness. You could also say love is a way of seeing, not merely an emotion. A lot of people think of love as a state of affection for other people, maybe a state of bonding. And when we use that definition of love, then it's possible to have different amounts of love for different people based on how they act or how physically close we are to them. For example, people using that definition would probably say that they love their family members more than they love the nasty politician. But I don't think that that is a useful definition of love. For me, that is just having different levels of affection towards people. My understanding is that love is a universal perception that we apply to everyone in our life. Love is a framework that guides our values and our decisions. And so we see people based on that framework. We see people the same way. We bring our same state of consciousness to our closest family members or to the people on earth who we least like, right? So with this definition that love is a state of consciousness, it is a way of seeing, it is our level of wisdom, so to speak, then we love everyone the same way because we are applying our same level of wisdom to how we see anyone. Does that make sense? We are applying the same level of wisdom to anyone in our life. And so by that definition, the person we love the least actually shows us how much we're capable of loving at all. It is absolutely valid to have different levels of affection for people. I have far more affection for my close friends than I do for narcissists or most politicians. But I actually love the awful politicians as much as I love my dearest friends because I see them with my same level of consciousness. I see them all with the current level of wisdom from which I'm operating. On this point, I want to unpack a little further this warped understanding of love that can come from religious programming, specifically around the idea of people being worthy or unworthy of love. Because if we get this idea that God sees us as unworthy of love, then we're going to move forward in our life thinking other people might be unworthy of our love based on their bad behavior, and that's just not true. There are people in my life who have behaved horribly to me. It doesn't make them any less deserving of my love. What it does is it changes how I interact with them. It certainly does, because that reflects my level of wisdom, my state of consciousness. But I see them with that same level of consciousness. So if we look at Christian theology, we see this idea that humans are, quote, unworthy of God's love and salvation because of original sin or because of our own sin. And because of that unworthiness, there's nothing that we can do through our behavior. Like if you listen to any Christian apologist on a major podcast, they'll reiterate something along these lines. There's nothing we can do by changing our behavior to make us worthy of God's love and salvation. So God needed this virgin human man sacrifice trope so that we could get a heavenly hall pass that we don't actually deserve. And that's grace and that's love. Well, that is some very bizarre love, if you ask me. But this instills such a warped understanding of love that we could be unworthy of ultimate divine love? Absolutely not. Because it's impossible for God, the ultimate state of consciousness, the ultimate state of love, to not love everyone all the same, to the same degree, in the same way at all times, because that's what God is. So this concept that humans are, quote, unworthy is just a projection from human ego, right? It's a God made in the image of human ego, not an accurate representation of God. Like, for example, a human man could create children that he doesn't love, not because of who the kids are, but because of who the man is. If a parent is not capable of loving their children, that doesn't tell you anything about the children. It tells you a whole lot about the parent, though, right? The child unworthy of love says nothing about the child and everything about the parent, okay? So Christianity's concept of humans unworthy of God's love and salvation without a human sacrifice trope, this says nothing accurate about God, and it says everything about the humans who originated this idea. A second principle of what is love is that love is interested in connection, not validation. So validation is finding your identity through other people's judgments, through their criticism, through their praise, through their worldview and their value system. Their perceptions of you matter to you. Validation often sounds like, if we're looking at internal dialogue, if I get the outsides right, then I'll feel good on the inside. So if, for example, if I have the certain car, if I make the certain amount of money, if I have the certain attractive person as my mate, if my family looks like this, if my kids behave this way, if I do these certain things and have these certain achievements, then I can feel good, right? It is actually using appearance and status and tribalism as a means to an end of feeling security and confidence and love. But that really doesn't work. You can't use any of those like ego tools as a means to love. The only means to love is love. Love is your way to love, right? Security is your way to security. Not jumping through these hoops of trying to get the outside right. It's kind of like what I think George Carlin, the comedian, said something like, trying to find inner fulfillment through buying things or achieving things is like taping sandwiches to your body to fulfill hunger. Now, on the flip side, connection is finding your identity not through other people's perceptions, but through a sense of being part of a greater whole, through an actual experience of love. My definition of love that I came out with after my mystical experience is that love is that which connects everything. So when we can find ourselves in this experience of true connection, we find our identity in being part of a whole. And that's where this sense of purpose comes in, and real life meaning. And when we can get in touch with real connection in our life, whether that's connection to nature, connection to others, connection to creating things, then chasing validation becomes irrelevant. And on this path, I see connection and validation as two ends of a spectrum. So the people who value validation the most take themselves farther and farther away from connection. With every step towards validation, you move away from real connection. And on the flip side, with every true step towards connection, you move away from validation. And so the journey to getting more connected to love often looks like failure in the eyes of the world. But the cool thing is that matters less and less, because every step you take away from validation towards the connection end of the spectrum, yeah, you're going to get perhaps worse judgments from the outside, but the flip side is it matters less and less. So it's a beautiful, beautiful process that balances out. It is quite possible to move towards the end of that spectrum of connection and have externals that other people would consider validating. For example, there can be wealthy people who are very connected, very fulfilled, and having a true experience of love in their life, but they went after love as a means of love. They didn't go after the externals of money, and they're not confusing money as their real security. Their real security is connection to God. And the externals may be there, but so this is why it's kind of hard to tell just by looking at the outsides of a person's life. Are they on the spectrum of validation or connection? As you develop discernment and wisdom, at least this has been my process, where they are on that spectrum can show in their eyes. It can show in their tone of voice, their energy, but just based on like a snapshot of the externals in their life, it can be difficult to tell. But somebody who's on the level of the connection end of the spectrum, if the externals leave from their life, it doesn't change who they are. It doesn't throw them for a loop. They don't have an identity crisis. They don't lose touch with any sense of security. If a person is at the far end of connection, they can lose all of their money, and they're not fazed because their security comes from God, not from this collective illusion that we call money. But if you're looking at someone at the validation end of the spectrum, like if their externals go away, they're in a full-blown identity crisis. They get panicked, they get vicious, they get desperate, they medicate to try to, handle that experience because the internal connection is just not there. It's all the externals. Let's look at a third quality of love, and that is nonviolence. Love is a level of consciousness that transcends the impact of physical force. And it really is the only tool that we have at our disposal. Love is the only tool we have at our disposal to end this cycle of war and violence that we seem to be trapped in on Earth. There's ideology that says we can end war with war. If there's violence, let's try to stop it with greater violence. What does war do? It creates war. The only way to peace is peace. It's simple, but this philosophy is so simple that I think humans have a very difficult time with it. And I certainly have. I'm going to share some examples of that in my own life. I want to start with illustrating a concept which you may or may not find believable. This is a story from the life of Byron Katie. Her name is spelled Byron, Katie, and she wrote a book that I think it's called Doing the Work. And it shares a thought reframing process to look at how we can also often fall into a trap of suffering more than we need to because of how we're thinking. And I found this reframe process very practical in my own life, so I certainly recommend it. And I know she has that reframe process available for free on her website. Now, I don't know if this story I'm about to recall is from her book or if I heard it in one of her interviews, but she was going to a prison to give a speech, and one of the prisoners ran up to attack her. And when he got close to her, instead of attacking her, he just fell down. And my hypothesis here would be that it was the love that was emanating from her. The fear and the pain and the anger in this man held no power over that force of love. Now, does that mean that we are completely resilient to any physical force or harm if we're at a high state of love? I don't think that's the case, but I do think that there is a protective quality generated from love that I've experienced, certainly in my life. And I don't know why it may be there in some cases, and it doesn't seem to be universal. Like, case in point, if we are to put any historical value in the canonical Gospels in the Bible, Jesus was killed, right? Jesus succumbed to violence, and a lot of people would consider him the most loving being who walked the planet. And that's where I want to get into another example of this nonviolent philosophy, because so many people would call themselves Christians, yet they have guns and they would use those guns to protect their property or their life, for example, from an intruder. And then at the same time, these people are asking themselves, what would Jesus do? Well, what did Jesus do? Again, if we're to put historical value in the canonical Gospels, and I do a deep dive in my book, Jesus Rewritten, about the historical authenticity or lack thereof in the canonical Gospels and in Gospels that were taken out of the Bible or not included. That's just a side note there. If you are someone who's like, yeah, I'm going to take that at face value, it was, the overview of Jesus' life that is recorded in our Bible. What did Jesus do when people were robbing him of his belongings? Well, he didn't take out a gun and kill them. He didn't try to preserve his belongings. He didn't try to preserve his life when people were attacking him and bringing him to a violent and unjust death. I've really taken the nonviolent philosophy to heart and chewed it over, and on a conceptual level, I can say that I believe it. I don't know what I would do if someone tried to physically attack me. I think that we don't know what we believe until we live it. And I haven't had to live that one, but I have experienced a protective effect as I have raised my consciousness, raised my level of wisdom over the years, where situations that it didn't make sense that I would come out of it safe or intact, or out of the impact of violence, somehow I did in a way that doesn't quite make sense to my rational mind. And one of those examples is my whistleblowing process. I did put my life on the line from this man who was a dark wizard, literally a man who practiced black magic and claimed and boasted that he knew how to kill people through black magic. And yet I came out of that experience with my life intact, not knowing when I went into that whistleblowing experience if I was going to come out of it alive. But I decided to really deeply trust that love is more powerful than black magic, that love and God's protection is more powerful than evil. So in that way, it is something I have lived through that aspect of this philosophy that love can counter violence and darkness. Another piece that I really had to take to heart was, does violence ever break cycles? Because in my whistleblowing process, the things that I learned that John had done to other women, I mean, let alone myself, but his other victims, how many there were and what he had done to them, it boiled my blood, to say the least. And I could make a very strong rational argument, and I did at the time with myself. I had many discussions with myself of why violence might be used in this situation to make people safer. I could rationalize that if John was killed, it would make my community a safer place. I could rationalize that if he was at least castrated, it would make women safer. And when I was in the depths of really thinking about this and kind of like arguing between my mind and my heart, really trying to put to the test this nonviolent philosophy, like I really was like, why wouldn't the world be a safer place if someone just killed this psychopath who is raping and hurting so many women and practicing black magic? Like, wouldn't the world be a safer place if he was just dead or castrated? And I had a dream at that time. I had a dream that I was strangling John. In my dream, John was this weak little baby, like this gray little baby, sickly, and I was strangling John. I could feel the air go out of his being, and it was like this tremendous force that was just surging through my hands. And in my dream, I did kill him. And then the instant that he stopped breathing, I heard from the deepest depths of my being this crystalline voice inside me say, in just pure grief, I am no longer a pure soul. And I woke up from that dream and I knew if we try to use violence to break a cycle, it never works, because trying to create justice through violence, it's not really whether the perpetrator, the evil person, would deserve violence enacted upon them, but what enacting violence does to ourselves. So there's a purity of soul that is so important to preserve. That's the takeaway I had from this dream, and I really came out of that realizing, okay, violence is off the table to create a safer and more healed world. I have to work with that philosophy moving forward. I know it can be easy to believe that the world would be a safer and better place if we just killed the dark-hearted tyrants, the nasty politicians, the predators, but this couldn't be further from the truth. You can take out the Hitlers or the predators, or in my case, the John Janisses, but you still haven't taken the darkness out of the people. You haven't healed the vulnerability in the collective consciousness that caused the collective consciousness to worship or enthrone or canonize or follow this manipulative person in the first place. And so until that is healed in the collective will simply elect, enthrone, worship another predator, and then whine about being a victim. Our families, communities, and world can only be healed when we heal within ourselves that which can be manipulated towards our own self-destruction. There's a line in my book, The Scorpion and the Lion, that goes, "This I have learned is how we break the cycle, not by eliminating the scorpions, but by awakening the prey." I've used phototherapy patches for over 4 years now, and they are my top recommendation for supporting injury recovery, healthy skin and hair, and overall vitality. These patches are backed by patents and double-blind clinical studies, and they use light frequencies to naturally increase your body's production of GHKU copper peptide, and that has extensive benefits for any health challenge. Now, this is very different than using injectable peptides, which I will not touch with a 10-foot pole. Injectable peptides are produced by pharmaceutical companies, which are arguably the companies which have the most extensive history of fraudulent data and corruption and bringing to market very unsafe products. And it's shown by third-party testing that these injectable peptides contain undisclosed ingredients. This should not be a surprise given the fact that pharmaceutical companies have a long record of putting questionable ingredients in their injectable products. If you're interested in learning more about phototherapy patches, check out my free info packet, which I will link in the show notes. This contains everything I wish I knew when I first heard about these patches and instructions to use this frequency modality on your wellness journey. Another principle to discern what love is that the truth is always love. Love and truth are interchangeable. We have to be truth seekers if we want to be people who bring love to the world. And we have to be willing to face the consequences of what the truth brings into our life. And a lot of times, that consequence can seem like a great loss. Because if we have built any part of our relationship or our career or our reputation, identity, financial well-being, whatever it is, on some piece that is not truth, then finding and integrating the truth is going to come at a loss of those things, the relationship perhaps, the reputation, the identity, the financial stability. And so the important thing to understand here is that whatever is lost in the pursuit and integration of truth is not actually a loss, it's an alignment. To a lower level of consciousness, it may seem like a loss, but all spiritual truth is paradox. So that means at one level, yes, it is a loss. At a higher level, it is aligning you in a way that's making you more powerful because it's bringing you closer to love. I've noticed that manipulators really count on their victims being adverse to facing the consequences of truth. So if we go through the world thinking that we're going to lose something we need if the truth challenges it, then we become ideal victims to manipulators. I'm going to read you another excerpt from my book, The Scorpion and the Lion, that illustrates this. And again, as I read this excerpt, I've used pseudonyms for John and for the Nutritional Therapy Association, so you'll hear those pseudonyms here. In Jay's whistleblowing process, I watched as hordes of frogs championed the scorpion and suppressed the voices of Jay's victims because they didn't comprehend the darkness in their community. These people thought of themselves as, quote, good people, yet, when gathered in an organized group, proved a powerful force for darkness. Many of my colleagues said I should handle the situation behind closed doors. They feared the news about Jay would harm the nutrition school and thereby disrupt their own careers. Yet the degree to which they remained naive of the darkness in their community was the degree to which each of them was being used as a pawn for the darkness. Ignorance is not bliss. Ignorance makes you, unwittingly, a scorpion's bitch. In my experience, the world's cruelest people are scorpions. Among the second most cruel are those who, when faced with the opportunity to see the truth, turn the other way. Every moment of life presents an opportunity to see more truth. They don't want to see their complicity in a harmful situation, which would compel them to make uncomfortable, ego-disrupting changes, or else exist with a crippling level of cognitive dissonance. The ego fears truth, whereas the soul thrives on it. It's possible to identify the degree of ego in a person by how much that individual protects their existing beliefs instead of seeking truth. Or, when challenged with contradictory evidence, they remain unwilling to change their beliefs. They prefer to remain trapped in the darkness of their fear, rather than face the light of truth. I'm going to read you another excerpt in a moment, but I want to interject with an observation I've had from what I would call the truther movement, people who have built their reputation or identity around looking at hidden truth in the world. But I see a great deal of irony here because many of these people, and I've never identified with this certain community, but I've gained some useful information from it. But many of these people, from my observation, tend to be quite jaded and closed-hearted. It's almost like they've done this work to really look in the dark corners and look at the skeletons in the closet, so to speak, of the powers that be in the world. And they haven't had the emotional capacity to integrate that in a healthy way or to really be faced with such evil and remain positive. But ultimately, that is missing the biggest truth that there is, which is that love is always more powerful than evil. Light is always more powerful than darkness. If you have a box, closed cardboard box, and inside is just dark air, well, if you take that box into the sunlight, you open the box, the darkness no longer exists. Darkness cannot exist in the presence of light. And so if you have somebody who claims that their identity is a truth teller or a truth seeker, but their heart is closed, they have yet to recognize and integrate the greatest truth of all. On that note, I'm going to read you another excerpt from my book. If you ask for the whole truth, it might come like a wrecking ball. It might leave you lying on your living room floor, arms out like a starfish, staring up at the ceiling with nothing in your life feeling solid. At least, that's how I felt when I learned the truth about Jay. It felt like everything I'd counted on wasn't there for me, and I didn't know what was coming next. I didn't even know how to make it to the following day. In that moment, you must, as I did, come to terms with 3 things. This is going to hurt. This is going to change everything. You can handle it. This moment is called a dark night of the soul, and it's always an invitation to a deeper level of love in your life. In the depths of pain, it's easy to think that the dark night is the end of your story. I could have easily thought that as I lay on my living room floor feeling flogged by the truth. Yet I remembered the lines I once wrote. This is the most beautiful love story I've ever lived. I realized those weren't mere words. They were a vow I made to my soul. A beautiful love story wasn't going to happen to me. It was something I would have to create. My story, in that moment of unraveling and pain, wasn't beautiful. That meant it wasn't the end of my story. It was simply the part that comes before getting closer to love. A 5th principle to recognize love is that it gives choice instead of taking it away. And this really is a continuation of the previous point that the truth is always love, because what is the primary tool of manipulators? It's to hide information. Because if you limit a person's information, in a way, you're limiting their choices. And one common line of manipulators is, this is just the way it is, this is your only option, this is the way the world works. Whenever you're hearing that, you're being manipulated. And maybe the person telling you that, they don't know any better, but when you get a line that is limiting reality in some way, you can be sure that it is coming from the fear inside a person or another person's attempt to limit your life through fear. The truth gives information. It gives fully informed consent, and in that way, it gives more options. This really is the concept of free will. Love honors free will, and in order to honor free will, you have to give fully informed consent. If you want to love someone, it involves telling them the truth. If you want to love yourself, it involves looking at the truth, maybe truth that makes you uncomfortable. But being truthful with yourself is love for yourself, and it's love for everyone else in your life. One example of this dynamic of how the opposite of love is controlling and limiting information is in the Mormon religion. My friend left Mormonism, and I learned a lot about that cult and organization by watching her process of leaving that religion after growing up in it. And one of the things she told me is that there's such a thing as, quote, anti-Mormon literature in this organization. Essentially, any book or historical document that contains unfavorable information about Joseph Smith or other leaders in the organization is labeled by the clergy as, quote, anti-Mormon literature. But this label has been put on a lot of, as you can imagine, factual history about Joseph Smith, because facts about his life paint him in an unfavorable manner. But this is a manipulation tool that's used to dissuade Mormons from reading these factual historical accounts. And so whenever there is information control, like trying to prevent grown adults from accessing information, you know that there is manipulation at play. You know that there is fear at play. We can see the same thing in the history of the Catholic Church. They had a banned book list that contained books by Copernicus and Nobel Prize winners. I could go crack open my book, Jesus Rewritten, and give you some examples of that. But I mean, even in many different religions, they might not have an official banned book or anti-Mormon literature list, but there's this idea that you shouldn't read or expose yourself to other perspectives or other worldviews because it could put your, faith at risk. But that really is a ploy of manipulation to try to limit a person's access to information. The truth never fears lies. It never fears different perspectives because the truth shines brightest, and actually lies make the truth shine brighter and help us discern what's truth from fiction. So if you have somebody who's trying to prohibit you from looking at other worldviews, perspectives, or data, that's a good indicator that there's some manipulation at play, not love. The last principle to recognize love that I'll leave you with for today is that love doesn't rescue someone from the consequences of their choices. One of the most effective manipulation techniques that I have encountered is when a manipulator tries to elicit pity or guilt for the hardships that they're experiencing or the struggles that they're experiencing due to their life choices or trauma that they experienced in the past. Manipulators play the victim card so well. Like, they are Academy Award-winning actors at playing the victim card. The point is to try to elicit feelings of guilt or obligation in the victim, so then the victim will try to save the manipulator by giving the manipulator certain resources. Now, the thing is that we are susceptible to buying someone else's victim card to the degree we are playing the victim card in our life. Now, I say victim card, I know that can be triggering for some people to hear, and I understand that we can be victimized by people, by predators, or by certain life events. I know that from my own experience. But like I said, spiritual truth is a paradox. So at one level of consciousness, we can be a victim to a person or an event. And at a higher level of consciousness, we can choose to see responsibility in that situation. And by responsibility, I don't mean this way of thinking of, oh, it's my fault that this happened to me. No, responsibility is the ability to respond. So we look at what choices are we making now that keeps pain and trauma in our life and our body, and we choose the ability to respond differently and to make different choices now. So that which happened to us in the past no longer holds power over us in the present and in the future. Okay? So there is some nuance here, but when I say, manipulators often play the victim card, they will say that they are, just victims to bad things that happen to them. And as a result, other people should take pity on them, have sympathy on them. Other people should take care of them. And it is guilt tripping. And we do fall for it to the degree we have not cleared out the victim mentality in our own lives. Another reason this rhetoric is so easy to fall for is that it's easy to confuse guilt with love. But guilt is a fear-based emotion, and love isn't, okay? Guilt does not come from a consciousness of love. It does not come from a place of recognizing that we have what we need to heal anything that's been done and to, be independent from pain that may have happened to us, and that anything can be healed in the presence of enough love. The other thing that can trip people up is when they don't recognize the difference between obligation and honor. And manipulators will often take advantage of this, right? We might feel obligated to try to help a manipulator, try and save them from the consequences of their own actions, right? Well, obligation is being a slave to another person's fear-based level of consciousness. If you think of a place where you feel obligated to help another person or serve another person, really dig deep at what is underneath that. Is it fear? Is it fear? Because honor comes from a consciousness of love, and honor is making yourself available to being an instrument of God's love, no matter how deeply misunderstood by other people you're going to be. And when it comes to obligation, there often is a big driver of validation there, of, oh, what will other people think, or how do I have to act to have other people's approval and validation here? Honor lacks any of that reasoning. Honor is about being willing to lose your validation, your reputation, your identity, because you are on the path of love. And you're willing to follow God's instructions for you, whether you want to or not, or whether you like it or not. Now, if you've been in a situation where you've been convinced that you are obligated to save someone from their bad choices or from their unfortunate trauma, you know what happens. If you've lived this, you know what happens. You don't end up saving the manipulator. You don't end up fixing their life. No matter how hard you try, somehow it just seems like they stay kind of at the same place in their life. But what happens to you? Well, you get drained of your resources. You will get drained of your life force, your vitality, your energy, your money, whatever it may be. The manipulator, using this rhetoric of guilt and obligation, is going to chew you up and drink your life force and spit out the shell, and then move on to the next person. The important thing to recognize is that you can't save someone from the consequences of their actions. You cannot save another person from their level of consciousness. The only thing that can save them is them raising their consciousness, them getting closer to love and connection and truth. It is an inside job. In the same way, this is where we need to look at a savior complex that may be within ourselves. Maybe there's a place where we are waiting for someone to come along and save us from the bad trauma we experienced or the unfortunate circumstances we're in. And as long as that is in our psyche, then we're going to be susceptible to someone else manipulating us using that rhetoric. A manipulator will tell you that you should keep them company in the hell that they've created of their life, that you are obligated to stay down in hell with them and make them comfortable there. And that's loving them. That is the warped definition of love that a manipulator will sell to you. But that is not loving anyone, especially not yourself. At the end of the day, the only one you can save is you, because the only mind you can change is yours, and the only eyes you can open are yours. Love means climbing out of the hell and making your home a heaven on earth. And then, if anyone wants to join you, they can, because you have shown them the way. You have gone first and paved the path. It's like you've metaphorically carved those wagon wheel ruts in the prairie and started making the Oregon Trail so that other people can follow your path. That truly is love. You've got to go first, and sometimes you've got to go alone. Another thing to watch out for is that often trying to save another person is a procrastination attempt to avoid changing ourselves and making this climb ourselves. So it's much easier to stay in hell and blame another person for not climbing out of hell with us or not climbing out before us. So as an example, I had a friend where every time I saw her, she would complain about her husband not changing and how her husband was just stuck in a rut in his life and doing these same things over and over. And we had this conversation a handful of times, and it got to the point where I was like, well, look, what are you doing different in life? Because if he's doing the same thing over and over, and every time I see you, you're complaining about it, you're not changing either. And we actually sat down and made a list together of the places where he wasn't changing in his life and how it was reflected by her not changing in similar ways. And I was able to walk her through this because I've had to do that in my life myself. I've had to make that list to myself. Yeah, I'm raising my hand here. I've definitely been there. And I had to look at, I am blaming another person for not changing as basically a very sneaky way for me not to change myself. If I can blame them for keeping me stuck, it lets me off the hook of taking responsibility for keeping me stuck. So that's an important dynamic to look at here. Love enables you to climb out of hell and to open your eyes and to raise your consciousness. And at the end of the day, that is the only thing that's going to save you. And when you do that, you become an example for other people. And you can actually show them the way. You can give them the map. Should they want to take it, should they ever want to read that map, they can come to you and ask you for it because you've gone first. And that is love. I'm going to close this podcast episode with a poem that I wrote in 2020 about the COVID fraud and watching what was happening, recognizing on a global level that predator's playbook that I had lived through in my abuse and whistleblowing process. So this poem is titled How to Control the World in 10 Easy Steps. First, keep your victims in a constant state of stress. Make them feel guilty about play and naps and rest. Their anxiety is your precious currency, so it's essential you create an environment of intense uncertainty. Your rules must be random, illogical, and entirely emotional. 2 weeks to flatten the curve works very well because you keep changing the goal. Second, poison them slowly, just a little bit. You need them physically weakened and just slightly sick. Say the poison is medicine and that you know best because you're a scientist or an expert, and this is cutting-edge progress. Encourage fad diets, eating disorders, and plenty of pills, and call those who dissent the quacks and money-hungry shills. Put fluoride in their water, radiation in their air. It doesn't matter what the science says, as long as you call the poison healthcare. Third, it's critically important that they feel virtuous for their unquestioning obedience. When they obey, tell them that you like them more, that they're better than the rest. Most are so insecure, they'll take whatever praise they can get. Give them the occasional compliment and pat on the back, but keep them on their toes with shame, blame, and emotional attacks. You'll be surprised at how quickly they stop thinking and just await further orders. It helps to buy out the media and pay off a few reporters. Fourth, tell them they aren't safe to take a single step without your explicit approval and written consent. Every battered woman lives in deathly fear of her abuser discovering she's made a choice without his all clear. It keeps her groveling for permission and under his control, instead of listening to her heart and obeying her own soul. So you must do the same. Just call it by a different name. Consider the terms lockdowns and mandates and vaccine passports. In the end, you know it's the same game. Fifth, make them reject what you know to be powerful and true. Tell them that life came from nothing out of the blue. Say there's no higher power, no spirit, no soul. If they think reality is purely physical, you've achieved the ultimate goal. While you cast dark hypnotic spells in the psychic dimension, they'll ignore that reality with their scientific condescension. Sixth, silence the shamans. Those for whom the veil is thinner, they're the ones to worry about because they're not spiritual beginners. It's much harder to convince them that the physical world is all that matters because they ask the big questions and their souls feel the answers. So get them when it's early, medicate them when they're young, try to make them normal, tell them being different is being dumb. The shamans can't wake the masses you've hypnotized if the shamans don't have the courage to be shamed and criticized. Seventh, make them fear the healers, those who trust the inner wisdom. Instead, they must see their body as a machine, a curse, a prison. Condemn all ancient practices like energy work and Chinese medicine. Tell them it's all pseudoscience and thoroughly unproven. Insist that spiritual healing techniques are primitive and utterly without proof. Only Western science can have the last word on truth. Label everything else colonialism and white supremacist, but not this. Eighth, label your exes as crazy and tell your story first. Make yourself the well-intentioned victim. Tell the truth, but reversed. Say you're the one under threat. The disinformation is harming you. You're on the side of justice. You're fighting for what's true. Say those who've suffered your psychic assaults and pharma's injuries are just money-hungry criminals lying blatantly. Ninth, tell them they'll cause their family harm if they follow their intuition instead of your alarm. Keep them distanced from family and friends. It's what all abusers do. It's a means to an end. Say their hearts aren't to be trusted. They're not the expert on their life. Insist they need your knowledge to avoid pain and strife. Promise them salvation. Say you want what's for their best. Then say they're selfish. That's the magic word. Every time they protest. It works every time. Abusive men know this well. It's why their victims often stay for the kids and don't realize they're staying in hell. 10th, rid yourself of empathy, but pretend you care so deeply. All you can do is pretend, of course, because you've killed your heart completely. You don't see your victims as equals. You see them as animals or things, and you care only for the wealth and power your victims bring. In a way, you do love them, but your experience of love is what the fox feels for the hen. You're safe for now. They're under your control. The only impending disaster is when your victims start to love themselves as much as they love their predatory masters. Thanks for listening to this episode of the Truth Activist Podcast. You can find the books I've mentioned in the show notes, and please drop a review if you enjoyed listening today. Stay tuned for the next episode. Bye-bye.